I'm Charlie Alfieri in the English department. I want to thank the sponsors for inviting me to moderate. And I used to play with my children a game called just 3 independent facts, and you would judge the power of the story that they told out of these facts. And I was reminded of that by these 3 quite independent papers, and we will see what we can make of it. The first speaker is Olivia Dill from the History of Art and Physics Department, and she was the title of her talk is "Following Changes: A Study of Botanical Illustrations Modeled After Jacques Le Moyne de Morgue." I give you.
Talking about a large group of artworks, all of which, through the support provided by CERF, I was able to observe and handle in person at the British Museum and the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. These artworks were all made by or modeled after the work of the artist Jacques Le Moyne de Morgue. Born in Dieppe, France in around 1533, Le Moyne trained as a manuscript illuminator, work which often required him to paint flowers. In 1564, Le Moyne was recruited as the expedition artist for a crew venturing to Florida to research the viability of setting up a French colony. Le Moyne produced the primary visual records of the expedition, artworks which give information about the geography, flora, and fauna of Florida, all while effectively defining Native Americans to the French would-be colonizers. I mention this early work because it testifies to his skill as an artist to juggle and to consolidate different kinds of information and to balance artistic conventions, political tensions, and national identity, skills which we will see again later. Le Moyne returned to France in 1566 and worked until he was forced to flee in 1572 to avoid being killed as part of a mass slaughter of Huguenots. Le Moyne settled in England, where he then turned to painting common English garden variety flowers and fruits. Among other projects, he made a volume of 59 watercolors in around 1575, which you'll see on your left side here, one of the examples from that set. And he also made another volume of 50 watercolors, which you'll see, one of which you'll see on the right. And this set revisits some of the same subject matter from the earlier set and was made for his patron at the time, Lady Mary Sidney. He also made a small pattern book of colored woodcuts based largely on these earlier works and intended to educate and delight artisans, nobles, and artists. He published the pattern book himself and supervised its production in 1586, 2 years before his death. Le Moyne's botanical work circulated after his death and became models for Crispin de Passe I, an ambitious Dutch engraver and publisher. De Passe grew up and trained in Antwerp before, like Le Moyne, moving to other countries, first Cologne and then Utrecht, to escape religious persecution. In Cologne, he designed and engraved and published the final component of my research, a book of 61 plates marketed to educated readers across Europe. These images were largely taken from Le Moyne's works, and de Passe revisited these plates again in 1614 when he modified them and published them as an appendix to the more ambitious botanical illustrations of his son in the widely circulating work Hortus Floris. This later book of engravings was published in many languages and was intended to be colored in by its owners, and it claimed to give a view of the garden moving through 4 seasons. In bringing together these artworks, we are considering a diverse group of images. We are working with 4 sets, in total over 200 artworks, created over a span of about 40 years, and in 3 different media. They're created in 5 different working conditions with the input of 2 primary artists. Yet, in spite of, or perhaps because of, these vast differences, these artworks participate in various vitally important dialogues. They speak to their predecessors and to their contemporaries, both within and without the sets to which they belong. These artworks speak directly to previous artworks, first by copying, seldom blindly as we see here, but more often while making modifications, both major and minor. They speak also by opposition, by pushing back and undoing conventions and interpretations in previous artworks. They argue indirectly by their existence within the genre of botanical illustration and their total refusal of the emblematic symbolism, text-reliant diagrammatic simplification, and very importantly, mobilization of metaphor, all of which are characteristics of uses of botanical subjects in various other visual traditions. In addition to creating artworks that speak to prior works and allow us to watch artists' stances change in time, these artists have made works which speak synchronically through comparison with the artworks with which they are bound by way of proximity, order, and contrast. It is through constructing artworks which facilitate discussions and arguments visually that these artists take stances in important debates of the time. Comparing collections reveals a discourse about how to conceive of the plants being studied and shown. That is, just what kind of beings the plants are in this moment to the artist, and by extension, what kind of beings they are for the viewer. This broad discussion breaks down into several more nuanced discussions. First, comparison between the collections reveals changes in the extent to which artists discuss plants as real-world physical bodies. Artists grapple with the limits and permissions of their technology to communicate different amounts of three-dimensionality of their subjects, their physical weightiness, their recession into and protrusion out of the picture spaces into which the artists built them, and the textured materiality of their bodies. The close attention to the textural difference between the rind of the lemons, the fibrous white interior, and the smooth seeds of the citrus fruits, coupled with the uniform shift from the lightest tones of yellow and orange at the left to the dark shadow on the right, consistent with how we expect light to illuminate the surface of a rounded volume, all create objects which are believably present and tangible in the 1575 watercolor set, as well as in this specific example pulled out from that set. Similar attention to color and coherent shading on volumes creates similar understandings in the later watercolor set. DePass also attempts in his version of the lemon to show texture through short dashed lines and dots. He attempts the same subtle shift from light to dark, but fails to do so entirely convincingly in the medium of engraving, which is more binary in tone than watercolor. This results in a flat object of indeterminate physical makeup. We oftentimes do not see the same attempt in the Moyne's woodcuts of plants, where the lines of the woodcut itself are never used to create tonal regions, and where inconsistent coloring oftentimes colors in large areas with one stroke, and thus glosses over texture, which oftentimes loses the subtlety of tonality, which communicates three-dimensionality. And you can see all these things at work here in the translation of the daisy. The second discussion at hand revolves around just how lively Le Moyne and DePass mean their plants to be. Most of the watercolors of flowers depict plants in multiple states of blooming. Le Moyne, in the later watercolor sets, couples this variety with formal arrangements that guide the eye sequentially from one state to another, as in Hollyhock on the left, where our eyes trickle down from top to bottom, from buds to blooms, or in the lily, where we watch buds open as we rotate around the stalk, thus tying the eye of our movement across the page to the development of the plant in time, emphasizing movement in the short and in the long term. Hortus Floridus and Le Play de Champ oftentimes attempt to maintain this, but fail, due to attempts to consolidate composition, as we see in looking at the other renditions of Lily and Hollyhock. The earlier watercolors, however, oftentimes deliberately show plants in stagnant states, isolated, without emphasis on immediate or long-term movement. In addition to claiming movement within the frame, the 1585 watercolors are unique in the degree to which they often promise movement into the space of the viewer. In a move very characteristic of the later set, we frequently see Le Moyne establish the frame as a physical and a formal boundary by allowing it to cut off forms as we see in the leaves at the upper left and upper center of the frame here, in this image of a quince. And he also does this by having forms just barely skim along the edge of the frame at the bottom right. And this develops a tension with the frame. He does this at the same time that he frequently allows forms to extend over the edge of the frame, as you see with the fruit and the leaves even in more detail up the right. In bringing the frame into question, we encounter a third discourse, that of autonomy. To what extent would the artists have us believe that what we see within the frame is complete and independent? In Le Moyne's first watercolor set, he almost always claims, through a variety of strategies, that what is shown in the frame is, at least in some respects, complete. In one such strategy that we do not see again elsewhere, we see plants depicted as if they are uprooted, and therefore, to all appearances, to be visually studied, at least in this moment, as structurally complete. This strategy is reversed in the later watercolor sets, wherein we are never to believe that what is held within the frame is a complete entity. All plants are depicted as entering from outside the frame. By alluding to the phantom of the plant beyond the frame, Le Moyne in this set reminds us that what we see is part of a whole, supported and dependent on something outside of the frame. Furthermore, we also never see one example of a flower or a fruit. We always see subjects in groups clustered together. This promise of connection is carried through into La Plaie du Champ, which often maintains the frame in composition of the 1585 watercolors, while confusing it with a logistical decision to pair plants on the page with other plants, and with the fact that the edge is now a formal boundary between woodcut and paper, not between paper and viewer. We see a more complex degree of autonomy emerge in the engravings where plants are shown clipped as often as they are shown entering from elsewhere or growing from the ground, and are also embedded into a context of added background elements, including landscapes, figures,